She was running from a monster. But what she didn't know was that the real battle was just beginning. Tanisha stepped off that Greyhound bus in Atlanta with nothing but a battered suitcase and a heart full of shattered glass. The bruises had faded from her skin, but the ones carved into her soul? Those were still bleeding. Every creak of the floorboards in her new apartment sent her heart into overdrive. Every knock on the door made her freeze like prey caught in crosshairs. She'd escaped him, the man who'd turned love into a prison, but freedom felt like just another cage, one built from fear instead of fists. Atlanta was supposed to be her fresh start, her sanctuary, but the city didn't feel safe. Nothing did. Post-traumatic stress doesn't care that you've crossed state lines or changed your locks. It follows you like a shadow you can't outrun. The smell of his cologne lingering on a stranger's jacket. The sound of a door slamming 3 apartments down. Even something as simple as morning coffee could trigger the panic, the trembling, the tears that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Tanisha had read somewhere that survivors of domestic violence carry invisible wounds, that any small stimulus, a touch, a raised voice, even a song on the radio, could drag them right back into the nightmare they'd barely escaped. She was living proof. But here's the thing about survivors. They're stronger than they know. Tanisha wasn't going to let the past bury her future. So she did what broken people do when they refuse to stay broken. She started small. Morning jogs around the lake, feet hitting pavement in a steady rhythm that said, "I'm still here. I'm still breathing." She found a tiny apartment in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors minded their business and the walls didn't echo with rage. She set up an easel in the corner where sunlight poured through the window and started painting again. Abstract swirls of color that somehow made sense of the chaos inside her head. She texted old friends, the ones who'd worried about her, the ones she'd pushed away when he'd isolated her from everyone who loved her. Slowly, piece by fragile piece, she was putting herself back together. The community center job came next, teaching art to kids who looked at her like she had all the answers, when really she was still figuring out the questions. But it felt good, purposeful. She rejoined the church choir, letting gospel hymns fill the cracks in her spirit. Her sorority sisters welcomed her back with open arms and knowing looks. They didn't ask too many questions. They just loved her through it. Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house became sacred rituals. Fried chicken, collard greens, laughter around a crowded table, and the kind of love that doesn't need words. This was her anchor, her black community holding her steady when the storm inside threatened to pull her under. She even started going to open mic nights at the local cultural center, standing on that small stage with trembling hands and sharing poetry about survival, about courage, about the woman she was determined to become. Each word she spoke loosened the knots of fear wound tight around her chest. But here's what nobody tells you about healing. It's messy, non-linear. Some days Tanisha felt invincible, and other days she felt like that scared girl cowering in the corner, waiting for the next blow. And then there was the loneliness. God, the loneliness. She'd lie awake at night in that quiet apartment, and despite everything, despite the terror and the trauma, a part of her missed companionship. Not him, never him, but the idea of someone. The warmth of another body. A voice saying good morning. She knew she'd never go back to the man who'd called her worthless, who'd slammed doors and raised his hand and made her feel like nothing. But moving forward felt just as terrifying as staying stuck. Her counselor had warned her about this, how survivors often want another chance at love while simultaneously being terrified to trust anyone new. Tanisha was living in that impossible space between wanting and fearing, between hope and self-preservation. And then came that Friday, that rainy, unremarkable Friday that would change everything. Tanisha was juggling her coffee, her keys, and a stack of art prints she just had framed when the wind turned her umbrella inside out. She cursed under her breath, struggling with the mess of metal and fabric, when a car pulled up beside her. A man stepped out, tall, fair-skinned, sharp blue eyes, the kind of classic Southern gentleman look you see in movies. He was holding out a spare umbrella with this easy smile, like helping strangers in the rain was the most natural thing in the world. "Looks like you could use this," he said. His name was Dominic. Tanisha's first instinct was to snap, to push him away, to protect herself from any man who got too close. "It's okay. I've got it," she said, defensive walls going up fast. But something in his face stopped her. There was no agenda there, no hidden threat, just genuine concern and a guy getting soaked trying to help. So she let him. And when he offered to carry her packages to the nearby coffee shop, she didn't say no. They ended up sitting side by side at a corner table, sharing what was left of her latte. And somehow, against all her better judgment, Tanisha started talking. Really talking. About her hometown. About the art she taught. And then, in a moment of reckless vulnerability, about the relationship she'd escaped. She braced herself for the pity, for the awkward silence, for him to suddenly remember somewhere else he needed to be. But Dominic just listened. He looked her in the eye. He asked respectful questions. He told her about his own life, his own heartbreak, his Sunday morning church brunches, and his love for live music. And then he said something that cracked her open. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share that." That's when Tanisha felt it. A tiny spark of warmth in the frozen wasteland of her heart. This man wasn't her past. He was something different. Something maybe, just maybe, worth the risk. So here's the question that would define everything that came next. When you've been broken by love, when trust feels like a luxury you can no longer afford, can you ever really open your heart again? Tanisha gave Dominic her number. And in that single moment of courage, she set in motion something she couldn't take back. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed. A simple text, "Thanks for today. You're braver than you think. Dominic." 7 words that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. But bravery and stupidity sometimes look the same in the beginning, don't they? She was about to find out which one she'd chosen. Spring arrived in Atlanta like a promise the city couldn't quite keep. The dogwoods bloomed white and pink along Peachtree Street. Lovers held hands in Piedmont Park. And somewhere in the middle of all that hope and renewal, Tanisha was trying to figure out if she could be one of those people again. Someone who trusted, someone who loved, someone who didn't see danger in every shadow. Dominic called her 3 days after the coffee shop. Asked if she wanted to take a walk. Just a walk. Nothing heavy. And here's where it gets complicated. Because Tanisha said yes even though every survival instinct she'd honed over months of abuse was screaming at her to run. She'd learned the hard way that men who seem charming at first can turn into monsters behind closed doors. That kindness can be a mask. That "I love you" can become "I own you" faster than you can pack a bag. So why was she walking through Piedmont Park on a Sunday afternoon with a man she barely knew, letting him buy her ice cream, laughing at his terrible jokes about pigeons? Because healing isn't logical. It's not a straight line from broken to whole. It's messy and contradictory, and sometimes you have to do the scary thing precisely because it terrifies you. Dominic talked about his job at the tech startup, about the basketball league he played in, about how his little sister was studying engineering at Georgia Tech and how proud he was of her. He asked Tanisha about her art, about the kids she taught, really asked like he cared about the answers. And when they sat on a bench overlooking the lake and a jogger ran past too fast, too close, Tanisha flinched, actually jerked away like she'd been struck. She hated herself for it. Hated that her body betrayed her fear. But Dominic didn't ask what was wrong. Didn't push. He just shifted slightly, giving her more space, and kept talking about something else until her breathing returned to normal. That's when she knew he'd noticed. And that's when she knew he was choosing not to make it a thing. There's power in that kind of awareness, in knowing when to hold space and when to let someone breathe. They started seeing each other regularly after that, and Atlanta became their playground. The Beltline Trail on Saturday mornings, both of them with rescue dogs, hers a nervous pit bull named Honey, his a goofy golden retriever named Biscuit. The dogs got along better than Tanisha's anxiety did, but she was trying. God, she was trying. Dominic took her to this tiny cafe in Midtown where they read books aloud to each other. His voice steady and warm as he stumbled through poetry he didn't quite understand but read anyway because she loved it. She took him to her favorite soul food spot in East Atlanta, watched his eyes widen when he tasted her grandmother's recipe for smothered chicken that the restaurant somehow got exactly right. "This is incredible," he said, sauce on his chin, and she laughed, really laughed. for the first time in longer than she could remember. But here's what nobody tells you about falling in love after trauma. Every beautiful moment comes with a price tag of fear. Because the better things got, the more Tanisha had to lose. Every time Dominic texted her good morning, she wondered when he'd stop. Every time he kissed her forehead, gentle, patient, never pushing for more. She waited for the switch to flip, for the nice guy mask to slip and reveal the monster underneath. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop because, in her experience, it always did. Can you blame her? When you've been burned, you don't just forget how fire works. 3 months in, Dominic invited her camping at Lake Lanier, up in the North Georgia mountains. The idea of being that isolated, that far from help, made Tanisha's stomach twist into knots. But she went anyway, packed a bag, told her grandmother where she'd be, made sure her phone was charged, and went. Because at some point you have to decide if you're going to live or just survive. They pitched a tent under a canopy of stars so bright they didn't seem real, and Dominic built a fire while Tanisha sat wrapped in a blanket, watching him move with easy confidence. He told her about camping trips with his military dad, about how his family would drive up to Tennessee every summer and spend weeks in the wilderness. She told him about Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house, about the gospel choir that raised her, about how her community was her lifeline when everything else fell apart. And then, sitting there in the firelight, Dominic reached over and took her hand, just held it, didn't try to pull her closer, didn't make it into something it wasn't. Just held her hand like it was precious, like she was precious. Tanisha's throat tightened with tears she refused to shed. Not yet, not when things were this good. They fell asleep that night in the tent, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, and for the first time since she'd escaped, Tanisha felt safe. Really, truly safe. But safety for a trauma survivor is a double-edged sword because once you feel it, you realize how much you've been living without it, and that realization can gut you all over again. Summer came hard and fast, the kind of oppressive Atlanta heat that makes the air feel like soup. Dominic's family invited Tanisha to a 4th of July barbecue in the suburbs, and she almost said no. Meeting the family felt too real, too permanent, too much like this relationship might actually be something that lasted. But Dominic's eyes were so hopeful, and she couldn't find a good reason to refuse that didn't sound like cowardice. So she went. His mother was a tiny blonde woman with steel in her spine and warmth in her smile, the kind of southern matriarch who fed you until you couldn't move and made you feel like family within 5 minutes. His father was quieter, more reserved, but shook Tanisha's hand with respect and asked about her teaching job like it mattered. His sister, Maya, was brilliant and awkward in that way 20-year-olds are when they're too smart for small talk, and she cornered Tanisha by the potato salad to ask about her art. "Dominic talks about you all the time," Maya said, grinning. "Like all the time. It's kind of annoying, actually." And Tanisha felt something crack open in her chest. He'd been talking about her. To his family. Like she was important. Like she was worth keeping. But integration isn't always smooth. There were moments that day that reminded Tanisha she was navigating 2 worlds. When Dominic's uncle made a joke about rap music that landed wrong. Not quite racist but close enough to make her jaw tighten. When his cousin asked about her hair, natural in beautiful twists with that curious, almost clinical tone that black women know too well. Dominic caught her discomfort and smoothly changed the subject. But the damage was done. Not because anyone was malicious, but because being the only black woman at an all-white family barbecue in suburban Georgia requires a kind of emotional labor that's exhausting even when everyone means well. On the drive home, Dominic asked if she was okay, and Tanisha wanted to lie to say everything was fine, but instead she told him the truth. Told him about code switching, about the weight of representation, about how she was always aware of being the black girlfriend, even when no one said it out loud. And Dominic listened, really listened. Apologized for his uncle, promised to talk to him, asked what he could do better. He didn't get defensive, didn't make it about him, just heard her. That's when Tanisha realized she might actually be falling in love with this man. Love is terrifying when you've forgotten how to trust it. It's like relearning a language you once spoke fluently, but now the words come out wrong, clumsy, heavy with the weight of everything you've lost. Tanisha brought Dominic deeper into her world too. Sunday dinner at her grandmother's house, where the table groaned under the weight of fried chicken, mac and cheese, collard greens, and cornbread that melted in your mouth. Her grandmother, a force of nature in a church hat and sensible shoes, took one look at Dominic and said, "You better be good to my baby." Not a question. Command. And Dominic, to his credit, looked her straight in the eye and said, "Yes, ma'am. I intend to be." Her cousins grilled him, literally and figuratively, asking about his job, his intentions, his opinion on everything from the Hawks' playoff chances to his stance on hot sauce. Dominic held his own, laughing easily, asking questions right back, and by the end of the night, her uncle was teaching him how to play spades while her aunt critiqued his technique. "He's a keeper," her grandmother whispered to Tanisha in the kitchen. "But you take your time, baby. Don't rush your healing for any man." The physical intimacy between them grew slowly, deliberately, like a plant that needs careful tending to survive. First it was holding hands, then his arm around her shoulders at outdoor concerts, her head resting against his chest while local bands played blues and jazz under string lights. Then forehead kisses that made her feel cherished rather than claimed. The first time Dominic kissed her lips, really kissed her, they were sitting on his couch watching a movie she couldn't remember the name of because her heart was pounding too loud. He cupped her face so gently, looked into her eyes, and asked, "Is this okay?" Asked, like her consent mattered, like her comfort was more important than his desire. And when she nodded, when their lips met, it wasn't the desperate, consuming thing she'd known before. It was soft, patient, a question rather than a demand. She pulled away after a few seconds, overwhelmed, and Dominic just smiled and tucked her hair behind her ear. "We've got time," he said. "All the time in the world." But did they? Because the closer they got, the more Tanisha's trauma raised its ugly head, demanding to be acknowledged. 6 months in, they were at his apartment, kissing on the couch, and Dominic's hand moved to her waist. Nothing aggressive, nothing wrong. But Tanisha's body went rigid. She couldn't help it. Her breath caught, her muscles locked, and suddenly she wasn't in his apartment anymore. She was back in that house, in that relationship, where a hand on her waist meant something dangerous was coming next. Dominic felt the change immediately, pulled back, put space between them. "Hey," he said softly, "you're safe. You're okay. We don't have to do anything you don't want to do." His voice was steady, calm, and it took a few seconds for Tanisha's nervous system to catch up, to remember that this man had never hurt her, never raised his voice, never made her feel small. The shame hit her like a wave. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I just—" But Dominic shook his head. "Don't apologize. Not for this. Not ever for this." He made her tea. They talked. He asked questions about what helped, what didn't, what he could do to make her feel safer. And Tanisha realized she'd never had that before. A partner who cared more about her well-being than his own needs. Is that what healthy love looks like? Because if so, she'd never experienced it before. Fall arrived, and with it, new challenges. Dominic had learned Tanisha's triggers by then. Sudden loud noises, raised voices, being grabbed without warning. And he moved through the world differently because of it. He started announcing when he was coming into a room. He kept his voice even when frustrated. He never, ever grabbed her, even playfully. His friends noticed the change. One of them, drunk at a basketball game, joked about Dominic being whipped, and something dangerous flashed in Dominic's eyes. "Show some respect," he said, voice hard. "She's been through hell. If being considerate makes me whipped, then yeah, I'm whipped. And you need to grow up." The friend apologized, embarrassed, and Tanisha felt that warmth spread through her chest again. He defended her, not in some toxic, possessive way, but in the way that said, "This woman I love is worth protecting, even from casual cruelty." But protection only goes so far when the enemy lives in your own head. Tanisha's nightmares got worse as the relationship deepened. She'd wake up gasping, Dominic's arm around her feeling like a trap instead of comfort. And she'd have to remind herself where she was, who she was with, that the danger was over. Except it didn't feel over. Trauma is a liar that tells you the past is still happening. And some nights, Tanisha believed it. She started pulling away, missing texts, canceling dates, building walls again because walls kept her safe and love made her vulnerable and vulnerable meant hurt and she wouldn't survive being hurt like that again. Have you ever sabotaged the best thing in your life because you were too scared to believe it could last? That's where Tanisha was. And Dominic felt the shift. He wasn't stupid. He could feel her drifting, could see the fear in her eyes when he reached for her hand. But instead of pulling away himself, instead of protecting his own heart by bailing first, he leaned in, showed up at her apartment with takeout and no expectations, sent her texts that said, "No pressure, but I'm here when you're ready," gave her space without giving up. That's the thing about real love. It doesn't run at the first sign of trouble. It plants roots and weathers the storm. 10 months into their relationship, Tanisha's ex-boyfriend found her on social media. Just a friend request, nothing threatening, but it was enough. Because seeing his name, seeing his face on her screen, brought back every memory she'd been trying to bury. The fear, the pain, the voice telling her she was worthless, that she'd never be loved, that she was damaged goods. She blocked him immediately, but the damage was done. That night, she called Dominic crying so hard she could barely speak. "He found me," she kept saying. "He found me." And even though found just meant a friend request and not a physical threat, the terror was real because to Tanisha, her abuser finding her in any capacity meant the nightmare wasn't over. Dominic drove across town at midnight, held her on her couch until dawn, and didn't leave until she fell asleep. When she woke up, he was still there, typing on his laptop, keeping vigil. "I wasn't going anywhere," he said when she stirred. "I'll never leave you alone in this." The cultural differences between them became more apparent as things got serious. Dominic's family didn't understand why Tanisha couldn't just get over her ex, why she needed therapy, why she flinched sometimes. They meant well, but their privilege showed. They'd never had to fear the way she had. Meanwhile, Tanisha's family worried Dominic couldn't understand the specific ways she needed support, the cultural context of her trauma, the weight she carried as a black woman surviving abuse in a world that often blamed victims who looked like her. Her cousin pulled her aside at a family gathering and asked, "Is he really getting it? Like, really?" And Tanisha didn't have a perfect answer because the truth was complicated. Dominic was trying, learning, growing. But could someone who'd never experienced what she had truly understand? Or was she asking for something impossible? They had their first real fight 11 months in. It started small. Dominic made plans without consulting her, and Tanisha felt controlled, triggered by the assumption that he could make decisions for her. "I just thought you'd want to go," he said, confused. "It's just dinner with my parents." But to Tanisha, it wasn't about dinner. It was about autonomy, about the right to choose, about not being told what she was doing. "You don't get to decide for me," she snapped, and something in her tone was sharper than warranted. Dominic's jaw tightened. "I wasn't deciding for you. I was trying to do something nice." And maybe he raised his voice just slightly, nothing aggressive, just frustrated. But Tanisha's whole body went into fight or flight. She stood up, grabbed her keys, headed for the door. "Don't walk away," Dominic said, and that's when it happened. Those 3 words that sounded too much like the commands her ex used to give. Tanisha froze, turned, and the look on her face made Dominic's expression crumble. "I'm not him," he said quietly. "Tanisha, I'm not him." And she knew that. Rationally, she knew that. But trauma isn't rational. "I need space," she said and left. She didn't answer his calls for 3 days. 3 days of sitting in her apartment, painting furious slashes of red and black, convinced she was making the right choice by walking away, convinced this proved she couldn't have healthy love, convinced she was protecting them both by ending it before it got worse. But on the 3rd day, her grandmother showed up. Didn't call first. Just used the spare key Tanisha had given her and walked in with a container of mac and cheese, and the kind of look that said, "Child, we need to talk." They sat at Tanisha's tiny kitchen table, and her grandmother didn't mince words. "That boy loves you," she said. "And I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt. But baby, you can't punish him for another man's sins. Dominic ain't perfect, no man is, but he's good. And good men who love broken women, They're rare. Don't throw that away because you're too scared to believe it's real. Was her grandmother right? Could Tanisha really tell the difference between legitimate red flags and trauma-induced hypervigilance? How do you know when to run and when to stay when your instincts have been rewired by abuse? These were the questions that kept her up at night, that made her second-guess everything. She texted Dominic on day 4, asked if they could talk. They met at Piedmont Park, the same place they'd walked on their second date, and sat on that same bench overlooking the lake. "I'm sorry," Tanisha said. "I overreacted. I know you weren't trying to control me." Dominic took her hand. "No," he said. "I'm sorry. I should have asked first. I should have been more aware. I'm still learning, Tanisha, but I want to learn. I want to be better for you." And there it was again, that willingness to grow, to adapt, to meet her where she was instead of demanding she change to accommodate him. They agreed to try again, to communicate better, to give each other grace when they stumbled. But grace only stretches so far before it snaps. 1 year into their relationship, almost to the day, everything came crashing down. They'd been sleeping at Dominic's place, wrapped up in each other, and Tanisha fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in months. Deep enough for the nightmares to reach her. Deep enough for her subconscious to drag her back to that house, that relationship, that version of herself who was small and scared and trapped. She dreamed her ex was standing over her, his hand raised, his face twisted in rage. She could hear him calling her those names. Worthless, stupid, ungrateful. Could feel the phantom pain of blows that had long since healed. And then, in the dream, she fought back. Screamed. Pushed. Ran. She woke up gasping, trembling so violently the bed shook, and for a horrifying moment, she didn't know where she was. Dominic's arm was around her, had been around her the whole time, and her brain interpreted it as restraint, as danger, as the thing she needed to escape. She jerked away so violently she nearly fell off the bed, her breath coming in ragged sobs, and when Dominic sat up, concerned and groggy, she scrambled backward. "Don't touch me," she gasped. "Please don't touch me." Dominic froze, put his hands up, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. "Okay," he said softly. "I'm not going to touch you. You're safe, Tanisha. You're in my apartment. You're with me. You're safe." It took several minutes for her breathing to slow, for her to come fully back to the present, for her to remember that Dominic had never hurt her, would never hurt her, that the danger existed only in her memories. When reality finally clicked back into place, the shame was overwhelming. She pulled her knees to her chest and sobbed. "This shouldn't still be happening," she choked out. "It's been over a year. Why can't I just be normal? Why can't I just be okay?" And Dominic, this man who'd been patient for 12 months, who'd learned her triggers and respected her boundaries and defended her to his friends, looked at her with such tender sadness it broke something inside her. "Because trauma doesn't follow timelines," he said. "And you are okay. You're more than okay. You're the strongest person I know." But Tanisha didn't feel strong. She felt broken, damaged, like a burden Dominic was carrying out of pity rather than love. "You should go," she whispered. "Find someone who isn't this much work. Someone who doesn't wake up screaming. Someone who can just be happy without all this baggage." And here's where the story could have ended. Where Dominic could have taken the easy out, protected his own peace, walked away from the woman whose healing was taking longer than either of them had hoped. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, hands still visible, voice still gentle, and said, "I'm not going anywhere. Do you know why? Because you're worth it. All of it. The nightmares, the hard days, the therapy, the patience. You're worth every bit of it. I'm not here because you're easy, Tanisha. I'm here because you're you. And I love you." It was the first time he'd said it. "I love you." 3 words that should have been romantic, should have been beautiful, but landed in the middle of her worst moment. And maybe that was perfect. Maybe love isn't about the candlelit dinners and sunset proposals. Maybe it's about showing up in the 3 a.m. darkness when someone's falling apart and saying, "I'm still here." Tanisha's sobs quieted. She looked at Dominic, really looked at him, and saw no judgment, no frustration, no resentment, just love. Patient, steady, unshakable love. I love you too, she whispered. But I'm so scared that loving you will hurt me again. Dominic nodded. I know, he said. And I can't promise you'll never hurt again. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise I'll never be the one who hurts you. Not intentionally. Not ever. They sat there on his bed as the sun started to rise, talking through everything. The nightmare, the triggers, the shame, the fear that she'd never truly heal. Dominic shared his own fears. That he wasn't enough. That he'd mess up and lose her. That loving someone with trauma meant walking on eggshells forever. They cried together, laughed at the absurdity of having this conversation at dawn, made a plan. Couples therapy, better communication strategies, boundaries they both needed to respect. And as the Atlanta morning light filtered through his bedroom window, Tanisha realized something crucial. She didn't have to be healed to be loved. She didn't have to be perfect to be worthy. She just had to be honest, to keep trying, to let Dominic walk beside her through the mess. But could she really do that? Could she really trust that this wouldn't end like everything else had? And more importantly, what would happen the next time her past tried to destroy her future? So here's the question that hung in the air that morning as Tanisha sat on Dominic's bed, raw and exposed. Could love really survive this? Could two people build something lasting when one of them was still fighting ghosts the other couldn't see? Because that's the thing about trauma, it doesn't just affect the person who lived through it. It ripples outward, touching everyone who dares to get close. And Dominic had gotten close. Closer than anyone since Tanisha had escaped. The real test wasn't whether he could handle one bad night. It was whether he could handle a lifetime of them. The morning after the nightmare, they sat on his back porch drinking coffee that had gone cold, watching Atlanta wake up around them. The birds were too loud. The sun was too bright. Everything felt too much and not enough all at once. Tanisha kept apologizing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Like a broken record, until Dominic finally put his hand over hers and said, if you apologize one more time for being human, I'm going to dump this entire pot of coffee over both our heads. It was absurd enough to make her laugh. A wet, hiccuping sound that broke the tension. I mean it, he continued. You survived something I can't even imagine. You're allowed to have hard days. You're allowed to struggle. And I'm allowed to be here for it. That's what this is. That's what we're building. But was that really what they were building? Or was Tanisha just dragging Dominic down into the wreckage of her past, making him responsible for healing wounds he didn't create? These were the questions that haunted her as the days turned into weeks. She went back to therapy, doubled down on it actually, and asked if Dominic could join her for some sessions. Her therapist, Dr. Chun, a woman with kind eyes and zero tolerance for self-pity, thought it was an excellent idea. Healing doesn't happen in isolation, she said. And if Dominic wants to understand, we should let him. So they went together, sat side by side on that uncomfortable couch in Dr. Chen's office, while Tanisha explained things she'd never put into words before. How her ex had started with small cruelties, criticizing her clothes, her friends, her ambitions, before escalating to rage and violence. How she'd lost herself piece by piece until she didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. How leaving felt like jumping off a cliff, not knowing if there was ground below or just more falling. Dominic listened to all of it. Asked questions Dr. Chun helped him frame in ways that were supportive rather than interrogative. What can I do when you're triggered? He asked. How can I help without making it worse? And Dr. Chun walked him through it, the importance of staying calm, of giving space, of using his words carefully. She taught him that trauma responses aren't logical, that Tanisha's body sometimes reacted to danger that no longer existed, and that his job wasn't to fix her but to be present while she fixed herself. She doesn't need a hero, Dr. Chun said, looking directly at Dominic. She needs a partner, someone who shows up consistently, someone who doesn't run when things get hard. Dominic met her gaze without flinching. I'm not running, he said. And for the first time since the nightmare, Tanisha believed him. But belief is fragile, isn't it? It needs constant reinforcement, especially when your past has taught you that trust is a luxury you can't afford. Tanisha tested Dominic without meaning to. pulled away to see if he'd chase, picked fights to see if he'd get angry, pushed boundaries to see if he'd push back. And every time, Dominic passed the test he didn't know he was taking. When she canceled 3 dates in a row, he texted, "I'm here when you're ready, no pressure." When she snapped at him for being 5 minutes late, he apologized calmly instead of defending himself. When she told him she needed a week alone to clear her head, he said, "Okay, take the time you need," and didn't guilt her for it. Slowly, painfully, Tanisha's defenses started to crack. Not because Dominic was perfect, he wasn't, but because he was consistent. And consistency, she was learning, was the antidote to chaos. 3 months after the nightmare, Tanisha did something she'd been avoiding. She went back to the community center where she taught art and signed up to lead a support group for domestic violence survivors. It was Dr. Chen's idea. Sometimes, her therapist had said, helping others helps us help ourselves. You have a story that could save someone's life. Are you ready to share it? Tanisha wasn't sure she was ready, but she showed up anyway. The first meeting, there were 6 women sitting in a circle, black, white, Latina, Asian, young and old, all carrying the same haunted look Tanisha saw in her mirror on bad days. She introduced herself, told them she was a survivor, told them she was still healing, and then she told them about Dominic, about finding love after trauma, about the fear and the hope and the messy, non-linear reality of trying to trust again. One woman, Maria, mid-30s with 3 kids, started crying. "I didn't think that was possible," she whispered. "I thought I was too broken." And Tanisha felt something shift inside her chest. "You're not broken," she said firmly. "You're healing. There's a difference." Leading that group changed something fundamental in Tanisha, because in helping those women see their own strength, she started to see her own. She wasn't just a victim of her past anymore. She was a survivor building a future. And that future included Dominic, but it didn't depend on him. That's a crucial distinction. She was choosing him not because she needed him to complete her, but because he enhanced the life she was already creating. Dr. Chun called it healthy interdependence. Loving someone while remaining whole on your own. It sounded like therapy jargon until Tanisha lived it, until she realized she could be happy alone and happier together, that those two truths could coexist without contradicting each other. Dominic noticed the change. Tanisha stood taller, smiled easier, stopped apologizing for taking up space. One Saturday afternoon, they were painting her apartment. She decided the beige walls needed color, needed life, and Dominic was covered in teal paint, laughing as Honey the pit bull tried to help by stepping in the paint tray. Tanisha looked at him, this man who'd shown up for her when she gave him every reason to leave, and felt something settle in her soul. Not completion, not dependence, just deep, abiding love. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Dominic looked up from scrubbing paint off Honey's paw. "For what?" And Tanisha gestured around them. At the apartment, at the mess, at the life they were building together. "For being patient, for staying, for loving me even when I made it really hard." Dominic crossed the room, left a teal handprint on her cheek, and kissed her softly. "You're worth the work," he said. "You've always been worth it." But here's what Tanisha had learned. You don't heal and then stop healing. It's not a destination you reach and then you're done. Healing is ongoing. A daily choice to show up for yourself even when it's hard. 6 months after leading her first support group, Tanisha had another nightmare. Woke up gasping, Dominic's name on her lips, fear coursing through her veins. But this time was different. This time, she knew where she was immediately, knew who was beside her, knew she was safe. She still shook, still cried, but she didn't run, didn't push Dominic away, just let him hold her, let him whisper reassurances, and breathed through it until the panic passed. "I'm okay," she said when her heart rate returned to normal. "I'm going to be okay." And she meant it. They started talking about the future after that. Real future. Not just let's see where this goes, but actual plans. Dominic wanted to know if she'd ever consider moving in together. Tanisha said maybe, but not yet. She needed her own space a little longer. He understood. asked if she wanted to meet his extended family at Christmas. She said yes and meant it. They talked about travel, places they wanted to see together, adventures they wanted to have. He wanted to take her to the coast, show her where he'd grown up near the ocean. She wanted to bring him to her family reunion in South Carolina, introduce him to aunts and uncles and cousins who'd quiz him harder than any job interview. They were building something, brick by brick, day by day, and for the first time since she'd escaped, Tanisha could see a future that didn't look like running. But the past has a way of showing up uninvited, doesn't it? 14 months into their relationship, Tanisha ran into her ex's sister at a grocery store in Midtown. Just a random encounter in the produce section. Rebecca, a woman Tanisha had once considered a friend, standing there with a shopping cart and a shocked expression. "Tanisha," Rebecca said, and time seemed to stop. All the progress, all the healing, all the work Tanisha had done threatened to crumble in that single moment. She gripped her own cart, knuckles white, and forced herself to breathe. "Rebecca," she managed. They stared at each other for a long, awful moment. Then Rebecca said, "I'm so sorry for what he did, for not stopping him, for not believing you sooner." And something in Tanisha's chest loosened. She'd carried so much anger toward her ex's family, toward everyone who'd known and looked the other way. But standing there in the fluorescent grocery store lighting, she realized she didn't want to carry it anymore. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that." They didn't hug, didn't exchange numbers, just nodded at each other and went their separate ways. But when Tanisha got to her car, she sat in the driver's seat and cried. Not from pain, but from release. She told Dominic about it that night over dinner. Told him how scared she'd been, how the encounter could have destroyed her but didn't. "I think I'm really healing," she said, almost surprised by her own words. Like actually healing, not just surviving anymore. Dominic reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been watching you heal," he said. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And Tanisha realized he was right. She'd been so focused on the hard moments, the setbacks, the nightmares, that she'd missed the bigger picture. She laughed more now, slept better, created art that was vibrant instead of tortured. She ran her support group with confidence. She stood up for herself. She loved without apologizing for her boundaries. She was becoming the woman she'd always been meant to be, not despite the trauma, but because she'd chosen to walk through it instead of letting it define her. 2 years after they met, Dominic planned a surprise. Told Tanisha they were going hiking, which wasn't unusual. They did that often now, exploring trails around North Georgia. But this time, he drove them to a spot overlooking the city, a quiet place where you could see Atlanta sprawled out below, all lights and possibilities. They'd been there before, actually, on one of their early dates. "Remember this place?" Dominic asked as they stood at the overlook. Tanisha nodded. "This is where I told you I was grateful for you," she said. "Where you told me I'd helped you feel like yourself again." Dominic smiled. "And you told me I'd helped you too, that we were healing each other." He took both her hands, and Tanisha's heart started racing. Not from fear this time, but from anticipation. "I've loved you since that rainy day when your umbrella broke," Dominic said. "I've loved you through nightmares and therapy sessions and hard conversations and beautiful moments. I've loved watching you become stronger, braver, more yourself. And I want to keep loving you for the rest of my life." He got down on one knee. Tanisha's hands flew to her mouth. She'd thought about this moment. Wondered if it would ever come, wondered if she was ready if it did. And standing there, looking down at this man who'd chosen her every single day for 2 years, she knew the answer. "Tanisha Williams," Dominic said, pulling out a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" The ring caught the fading sunlight. Simple, elegant, perfect. Tanisha was crying, but this time the tears were pure joy. "Yes," she said, voice breaking. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." Dominic stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and kissed her like they were the only 2 people in the world. And maybe in that moment they were. They got married 4 months later by the Chattahoochee River, surrounded by everyone who mattered. Tanisha's grandmother cried happy tears. Dominic's mother hugged her like she was family, because she was family now. The women from Tanisha's support group came, a living reminder of how far she'd traveled. Her sorority sisters served as bridesmaids, and Dominic's best friend gave a speech about never seeing Dominic happier than he was with Tanisha. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises about patience and honesty and showing up even when it was hard. And when the officiant said, "You may kiss your bride," Dominic cupped Tanisha's face just like he had on their first real kiss, asked, "Is this okay?" Even though they were at their wedding, even though everyone was watching, because consent mattered to him, had always mattered. And Tanisha laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Kiss me, husband." And he did. The reception was a perfect blend of their worlds. Soul food and barbecue, gospel music and country songs, aunties doing the electric slide next to Dominic's cousins attempting to line dance. Tanisha's uncle taught Dominic's father how to properly season ribs, and Dominic's sister bonded with Tanisha's cousins over engineering projects and bad reality TV. It was messy and loud and absolutely perfect. During their first dance, as Dominic held her close and they swayed to a song about enduring love, Tanisha whispered, "I never thought I'd have this. Never thought I deserved it." Dominic pulled back to look her in the eyes. "You've always deserved it," he said. "You just needed to believe it yourself." But this isn't a story about a perfect ending because real life doesn't work that way. 6 months into their marriage, Tanisha had another rough week. Triggers from an argument at work, a news story about domestic violence that hit too close to home, hormones and stress and all the ordinary things that get amplified when you're carrying trauma. She was short with Dominic, distant, wrestling with demons she'd thought she'd conquered. And on their worst day, when she snapped at him for something insignificant, Dominic took a deep breath and said, "What do you need from me right now? Not why are you like this? Or when will you get over it? Just what do you need?" And Tanisha broke. Told him she was scared she'd never be fully healed, that she'd always be too much work, that he'd eventually regret choosing her. Dominic listened. Then he said something that changed everything. "I didn't marry your trauma," he said gently. "I married you. All of you. The parts that are healed and the parts that are still healing. The strong days and the hard days. I knew what I was signing up for, and I'd sign up for it again in a heartbeat. Stop trying to protect me from loving you." That's when Tanisha finally got it. Really got it. She didn't have to be perfect to be worthy. She didn't have to have everything figured out. She just had to keep showing up, keep doing the work, keep choosing love even when fear told her to run. Marriage wasn't about being healed. It was about healing together, about building a life that had room for both joy and struggle, strength and vulnerability. She apologized for pushing him away. He apologized for not realizing she was struggling sooner. They adjusted, adapted, grew. Today, 4 years after that rainy afternoon when Dominic offered her an umbrella, Tanisha runs 3 support groups for domestic violence survivors. She's published a collection of poetry about healing and resilience. She and Dominic have a small house in East Atlanta with a yard for honey and biscuit, and walls covered in Tanisha's artwork. Vibrant, alive, full of color that would have been impossible in the darkness she escaped from. They host Sunday dinners that blend both their families, where her grandmother's cornbread sits next to his mother's potato salad, where gospel and country music play back to back, where love looks like respect and laughter and people from different worlds choosing to build bridges instead of walls. Tanisha still has hard days, still has nightmares sometimes, still carries the scars of what she survived. But she also has joy, purpose, partner who shows up, a community that holds her. And most importantly, she has herself, strong, healed enough to keep healing, brave enough to trust again. Her story isn't about being saved by love. It's about saving herself and then choosing to share that self with someone worthy of it. It's about learning that healing isn't linear, that setbacks don't erase progress, that you can be both strong and struggling, both healed and healing. It's about discovering that the right person doesn't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be honest. And it's about understanding that escaping the abuser was just the beginning. The real journey was learning to trust herself, to believe in her worthiness, to open her heart again despite every reason not to. So what about you? Are you carrying wounds you think make you unworthy of love? Are you convinced you're too much, or too broken, or too damaged for someone to choose you? Here's what Tanisha would tell you, what she tells the women in her support groups every week. You are not your trauma. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become in spite of it. Healing is possible. Love after trauma is possible. But it starts with you choosing yourself first, doing the hard work, building the life you deserve regardless of whether someone else shows up to share it. And if someone does show up, someone patient and kind and willing to walk beside you through the mess, don't push them away because you think you're not worth it. You are worth it. You've always been worth it. You just have to believe it. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from scratch? Have you learned to trust again after betrayal? Or maybe you're the partner of someone with trauma, trying to figure out how to love them well. Drop a comment below and share your story, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story resonated with you, if Tanisha's journey reminded you that healing is possible, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about real people overcoming impossible odds. Share this video with someone who needs to know they're not alone in their struggle, because that's how we heal, together, one story at a time. Thanks for listening, and remember, escaping is just the first step. Choosing to really live, that's where the real courage begins.